Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here and to continue to sponsor this conference. It has meant so much to environmental professionals, and it really is a premier opportunity for folks to interact with regulators and to figure out what it is that we're doing in the environmental professional space. And so thank you, Greg. Joining me today are Anthony Barber, Director, Oregon Operations Office of US EPA's Region 10, Rich Doenges, Southwest Region Director, Washington State Department of Ecology, and Richard Whitman, Director of the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. And like last year, I have a set of questions that I'm going to ask these folks and give them an opportunity here, the better part of an hour, to learn a bit more about what each agency has been working on over the past year, how they've been working together, and what they see for the future, for the coming year. You'll all have opportunities to meet with these agencies and their staff as this conference unfolds. Now, for purposes, I'm told, of video quality, though I did watch myself on last year's video and I couldn't believe you would put the word quality with that. In any event, for video quality, I'm told we're going to keep this to a Q&A format between me and the participants up here on the stage. So save your questions. Do ask them of the agency folks that you see in the halls as you see them. And then there are, I guess, specific formal sessions tomorrow that each agency is holding where they're going to invite those sorts of questions in that dialogue. So please do save up all your questions, as they'll have opportunities to be answered. For now, I'll start with in alphabetical order. That's just so that I can force EPA to go first each time. Anthony, what do you see as your agency's biggest accomplishments this year?
So I lose in multiple cases, right? So EPA,
Yeah.
Anthony, Barber. Okay, I just can't win. Biggest accomplishments. So over the last year and a half, there's a number of things that stand out as great pieces of work. One of the things I think about that I was thinking about yesterday quite a bit is we're all about creating a level playing field, and we've really focused a lot on cheaters. And when I say cheaters, I mean those that are producing counterfeit products and trying to import them into the United States that are adulterated, improperly labeled pesticides, things like that. No big names, but names that rhyme with Mamazon. That we really tried to work closely with to curtail that sort of thing. Aftermarket defeat devices that really just destroy our efforts to curtail auto emissions. We've really targeted, and we continue to do so, but we've made a lot of headway and a lot of progress in that. We've made a big accomplishment. We've got natural disasters and man-made disasters that occur, and one of the things that we did really well last year that we're really proud of is our response to the Paradise, California wildfire. 7,000 homes, many businesses were burned out, lots of people dislocated. We took a process, our part of which would have taken a year normally, we reduced that down to about 2.5 months and came in many tens of millions of dollars under budget and got that community back toward recovery much quicker than anybody expected. So that's just to start with.
Thanks, Anthony. Rich?
Thanks, Geoff. I think looking back on 2019, there's a couple of successes that Department of Ecology is very proud of. I think one of the first ones would be, after 40 years, 42 years to be exact, the culmination of the Yakima water rights adjudication. That in partnership with the integrated basin plan really sets the stage for the irrigators, the tribes, in-stream fish rules to proceed without kind of the cloud and of litigation that may be disappointing for some attorneys in the crowd. But after 40 years, the participants, working really closely with the Department of Ecology and others, finally came to a resolution. And that was such a long time coming. That was a tremendous moment. We had former Governor Christine Gregoire there, Maya Bellin, who had cut her teeth working on water rights issues. She was there for the ceremony, and that was a wonderful achievement. I think the other thing that we're proud of was a sustainable recycling bill that we helped work with the legislators to get across the finish line and the governor signed. And that deals with a real problem now. As we all know, China is not accepting recycled materials as it did before, and so this bill sets up a demonstration center, try to find ways to eliminate contamination in recycling materials, try to find innovative ways to deal and promote recycling here. And I think that'll be something that, while it sounds kind of mundane, it is an important effort for both businesses and the people of the state of Washington.
Thank you. And now Richard?
Thanks, Jeff. So for Oregon, it's been a good year. We consolidated gains in a couple of important areas. First of all, in terms of Oregon DEQ's leadership, as many of you know, we've had a substantial set of new faces come into Oregon DEQ over the last couple of years, and so getting those people on board, getting our leadership team working efficiently and well has been a major focus internally for the last year. We also were successful in the 2019 Oregon legislature in getting some significant new resources for some of our core work around air and water quality permitting. That work is going to take a couple of years to fully ramp up. The hiring didn't occur right at the end of legislative session. The funding sort of comes in gradually over time. But we are starting that process of ramping up and starting to work through some very long-standing challenges at the agency in terms of backlogs of permitting in both water quality and air quality, and to some degree in some of our inspection work. On the policy front, a couple of successes. First of all, this is my third year here, and the first 2 years I talked pretty much about air toxics and then about air toxics. And I don't need to talk much about air toxics this year, and that's one of the successes, is that the Cleaner Air Oregon program, the air toxics program in Oregon is underway, and we are working with companies. We've issued our first approval for Genentech for modifications to their permits to deal with the air toxics issues. So that's a real success to have that well into implementation. I also want to mention two other things very briefly. Electric vehicle registrations in Oregon. Oregon continues to be in the top 5 nationally among states for a proportion of sales of EVs as a proportion of new car sales. That percentage is increasing very rapidly, and we are well on the way to meeting Governor Brown's goal of having 50,000 EVs on the road by the end of next year. That's extremely important to us, as the main area of growing greenhouse gas emissions in Oregon is the transportation sector. So accelerating the conversion of our vehicle fleets to non-fossil fuel fleets is an important thing. Related to that also, our Clean Fuels program is also well into implementation. We're now 3 years into that program, and we've reduced greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector significantly as a result of that program. And then finally, a couple of projects. One of the things I inherited coming into the agency was one of the longest standing 401 water quality certification efforts in the nation for Idaho Power's Hells Canyon project. And we were able to negotiate through a resolution of that 401 between Oregon and Idaho Power, and so got that out the door, and I'm very proud of the effort to get that completed. We also issued another very significant 401 water quality certification, which was actually a denial of a certification for the Jordan Cove project down in Coos Bay. That is still a story that's very much in progress, but We were forced to act very quickly as a result of some court decisions in that case, and I actually list that as an accomplishment that the agency was able to pivot and issue a well-reasoned, significant decision in a very short period of time as a result of change in federal law or interpretation of law about the timing of those 401 water quality certifications. So I'm going to end there and turn it back to Geoff.
Thanks. Those really truly are accomplishments. Now we'll ask you to sort of bare your soul here a little bit and speak to your significant challenges or setbacks over the year, starting again with EPA.
So I don't know how much soul bearing I would do, I guess, but I guess one of the things that is a continuing challenge to Region 10, not necessarily EPA at large, is we are insistent that we make progress on getting remedial design set up for Portland Harbor, and it's a difficult road. Many of you may be even involved in that path. So we're continuing to press hard for that. But you know, the complexity, the range of perspectives and interests involved, the science and the politics and the money of that whole issue is continuing to challenge us. I don't think I would call it a setback at this point. I think we're on track, but it takes a heck of a lot of effort to stay there. So I guess the other thing, I mean, you could go down the list. No offense to any of the attorneys in the room. We have laws for a reason. We have lawyers for a reason, Geoff. But litigation is always a challenge, and we have provisions in law for lawsuits, but they often don't seem to serve the purposes that they're set out to, or say that they're pursuing. So that would be a challenge. And lastly, I guess I would say that on the federal landscape, the fact that we operate under continuing resolutions, oftentimes, more often than we have an established budget, is hard on our staff, it's hard on our program managers, and it's hard to actually strategically plan out a year, no matter what your priorities are, if you can't predict what your resources are going to be. And so that's a big challenge, and we've had a lot of setbacks that way. Thank you.
Thank you. One more swipe at attorneys and I'm coming back. Richards was an attorney at one point. He said, "Are you looking for help?" Yes. Anyway, thank you. Rich, it's your turn.
I'm not an attorney. I'll be gentle. I prefer to use the word challenges. So I think one of the challenges that the agency's been facing this year is, trying to work constructively with our federal counterparts when they're proposing changes in regulations that, at least in Ecology, we spent a lot of blood, sweat, and tears getting across the finish line. And that was, I'm speaking to the human health criteria. And so that's being proposed for some changes. And the proposed changes were significant enough that Director Bellin, I think with you, Richard, went and testified back in the other Washington about how important it was to maintain the status quo in the regulations, because because we need certainty. The regulated community values certainty. And where we ended up with was a standard that was going to support fish consumption as fish are eaten in Washington State by some of our most vulnerable populations. So we're assuming that we'll still be able to regulate based on that human health criteria. And something I may mention later is we're working on rulemaking right now to allow for some of the tools in our toolbox to be used. For instance, in the Spokane River, where we're looking to do rulemaking to allow for variances for some of the point sources there. I think the other challenge we had several very large energy projects, especially down here in the Columbia as well as in North Puget Sound. And I think what we were encountering is a growing concern from members of the public about climate change. and the idea of having a transition from our current, high carbon energy to a lower carbon energy as a transition to, truly meeting our greenhouse gas targets. There's an element in the population that we're telling us you can't do things the way you've always done it. And part of my job was to entertain some demonstrators in front of the Ecology office, which was a unique experience for me. We had folks from Puyallup Tribe and folks around Southwest Washington concerned about energy projects and a methanol project in the area. So I think that's something that is a challenge to work with. We have our regulations and our policy directions, but I would expect in the coming years there's going to be more pressure on our our elected leaders to look at making some changes there. So I think those are the two main challenges I wanted to share.
Thank you. And Richard, how about for DEQ?
Well, for Oregon, and I think for much of the country, the challenge of our time is really greenhouse gas regulation and reduction to try to avoid some of the worst impacts that we're starting to see some of already in terms of climate change. You're all aware that the Oregon legislature came very close to passing comprehensive greenhouse gas reduction legislation in the last legislative session. Legislators are working very hard, headed toward the short session in 2020, starting here at the beginning of February 2020, to try to get a sufficient consensus in the Oregon legislature to pass comprehensive climate legislation. They're going to make a significant try at that. But it was a big challenge, both looking broadly and also a challenge more narrowly in the political sense. Related to that, with all respect to our federal partners, the decision by Administrator Wheeler to change the auto emission standards, the midterm standards for vehicles, was a big setback for Oregon and really for the nation. Transportation greenhouse gas emissions is the sector where we're seeing the most growth really across the nation as well as in Oregon. And getting a handle on transportation greenhouse gas emissions really is the most important piece of that very significant challenge around greenhouse gas emissions. We're doing a lot of work looking at programs that we have to address that issue, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A session here today. The other challenge that I'll mention also is to echo some of what Tony said about Portland Harbor. We've been at it for over 20 years now on Portland Harbor, and we're coming up on 3 years since the record of decision on Portland Harbor, something that was a very significant work effort by a broad range of folks and experts. And so getting the responsible parties involved in Portland Harbor into remedial design so that we can frankly learn more about the site-specific conditions in the harbor and more accurately tailor remedies and know what the cost will be has been an ongoing challenge, one that I'm committed to continuing to focus on here over the next year. But it is very frustrating for the agency, but more importantly for the public to see the amount of time it's taking to get into actual cleanup in Portland Harbor.
Thanks, Richard. Shifting now our focus to looking forward to the coming year. Anthony, can you give us a sense for EPA, or maybe better, Region 10's top priorities or areas of focus for 2020?
Portland Harbor.
Yeah.
Let's see. So Portland Harbor, of course, in Region 10. We have Quindell Terminals, also another agency priority site up in Washington State. And, nationally, I think one of the things that we were talking about down at the table before we came up on the stage this morning, the administration has identified as one of the 2020 priorities we want to look at is ocean debris, the plastics. In May this year, Administrator Wheeler was at the G7 summit and talked with other countries about the whole cradle to grave supply chain and the recycling chain that's involved in keeping the plastics and similar debris out of the ocean. And what do we do with what's already there? So that's one of the priorities that he has identified for the coming year. Additionally, stationary air sources, particularly focused on those that emit high levels of volatile organic compounds and PAHs. We're looking at means to reduce those compounds emissions and to reduce noncompliance with our NPDES regulations for water quality. Then finally, I think there's a big focus for the coming year on, well, I'll mention two things. One, our risk management planning under the Clean Air Act, Section 112R. We want to do whatever we can to reduce accidents, reduce risks of accidents, and reduce their severity when they happen, and make sure that we're ready when they happen, inevitably. And then finally, I'm going to reach back to accomplishments and looking forward to more accomplishments. The water infrastructure program, the WAFIA loans that we've been engaged in over the last year and the next year, leveraged something like $11 billion in water infrastructure projects across the country. And here in Region 10, we've had in Washington County, particularly with Clean Water Services, Hillsborough and Beaverton, a $1.3 billion project to make sure people have clean drinking water. And we've got more on tap here for Oregon and Washington and elsewhere in the region and the country that we're focused on.
That's great. Thank you. Rich?
Yeah, thanks. Looking forward to 2020, I think three main areas that will be concentrating some of the work in the Department of Ecology, and that's in climate change, orca recovery, and then water resources. So in climate change, we're expecting to see some legislation out helping us quantify greenhouse gases. Staff are working on different measures to how better to track and account for greenhouse gas emissions, both downstream and upstream. This will be especially important as we start reviewing energy projects. In orca recovery, that was a focus for the legislature this past year, and then Ecology is putting that in effect in Puget Sound, specifically on efforts to reduce nutrient pollution in Puget Sound, and that's a large effort. There's additional monitoring that we're needing to do. We have a pretty robust model that'll be better informed by that modeling, and as we're issuing NPDES permits for wastewater treatment plants, we're going to be looking at limiting the amount of nutrients that they currently put out, and working closely with municipalities to ensure their plant is operating in a way that it maximizes the removal of nutrients from their existing technology. But that's an effort that's going to be growing, and complementing the work of improving the health of the sound for orcas, trying to fast track some of our toxic reduction efforts and cleanups. That's one of the limiting factors for orca, especially with PCB contamination. So, and then in water resources, we've got some local watershed-based planning efforts that are underway, and staff are actually going to be starting at least one adjudication effort in the state. Staff promise that it's going to be shorter than 40 years, maybe less. But I think that's really the best way to get those water rights in a way that it's well understood within the community, minimizes litigation, and really helps plan for increasing water. So the focus is not on battling over the rights, but really on different efforts to increase storage and better manage the water we have.
Thank you very much. Richard, what do you see for Oregon?
Well, again, on greenhouse gas reduction, whether it is working to help implement legislation that occurs in the short session, or if that does not occur, then looking at what tools we have in our existing authorities for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, along with other agencies and partners, as well as Oregon DEQ, has to be kind of our first regulatory priority. Another priority of Oregon Governor Brown is in the area of water resources, both water supply and water quality. So she is developing a 100-year water vision. There have been town hall meetings around the state with a number of partners and communities to help develop that and flesh that out. Ultimately, that probably looks like both new funding for water resource projects, both gray and green infrastructure, and likely a conversation and maybe some decisions about governance and how we make decisions about where we are investing our resources in terms of water resources development. That's pointed toward the 2021 legislative session, but important foundational work going on this next year. Within DEQ, we're working on a project called Your DEQ Online that is going to be discussed in more detail in a panel here tomorrow with DEQ folks, that is really modernizing our legacy IT systems. This is something we've been working on for 3 years, and we are going to be rolling into implementation in 2020. So the way that people apply for permits and report, pay invoices, all of that is going to be modernized here in Oregon over the course of the next year, something that is way overdue, but that I'm very proud that we've gotten the funding from the legislature to do and are hard at work on. DEQ also doesn't have a strategic plan, and we are in the early stages of that. There are RFP out right now for consultants to help us with the development of a strategic plan next year. So look for that to be occurring as well. And that will be both internally and externally focused. We'll be having conversations with folks in this room, EPA and others, as we identify our long-term priorities. And then finally, bread and butter work, just in terms of, again, reducing backlogs in core air and water quality permitting.
Thanks. To maybe pivot from a point that Richard just made, how do you see each of your agencies overlapping interests in the coming year? How might you diverge? Where might you work together? Sort of talk about the interagency dynamic, if you would. Anthony?
Yeah, so there are a little over 40 federal statutes that many states, including Oregon and Washington, are involved in implementing on a delegated or approved program status. EPA oversees a lot of that, or works with them to make sure that they're equipped and able to do a lot of that, and funds some of it too through our performance partnership grants and our agreement that we work with the states on to make sure that we're aligned as well as we can be. That is a great source of finding those overlaps. One of the things that's not in that arena, but also a very big overlap, is in all our cleanup programs across the states. So we collaborate on a lot of cleanup activity, and sometimes it's because we're working closely together because there's work that we need to figure out together, and sometimes the workload is so big that we divide and conquer, and the states may be better equipped to handle one cleanup activity and us another, and so we even though we're separate on some of those sites, we're communicating about them, about which one is better for which of us to address. One of those that's upcoming that we have a big overlap with both Oregon, Washington, and EPA is Bradford Island. Some of you know probably that it's there's a request to look at listing on the MPL for Bradford Island on the Columbia River. So that's just an example of one of those cleanup sites that we'll continue to be working together on. And then finally, one of the places we can't work as closely together on is things that are not delegable to states. So our spill prevention and countermeasures and controls plans and facility response plans for oil storage and the like. There's no provision to delegate them to states, so it's a federal thing that we have to do. So.
Thanks. Rich, how do you see Ecology or the Southwest region working with these two agencies?
I think kind of second a lot of what Anthony said, especially at the staff level, there's great coordination and working together. Staff understand the limitations or opportunities in each respective roles and responsibilities. One thing that happens, I think, across ecology is great coordination on enforcement issues. EPA staff is kept well informed of enforcement actions that ecology takes, and in some cases where they may take enforcement actions to another level, or they may investigate and then refer some matters for us to look at. So good coordination there, and part of that is around databases, the ISIS database, making sure things are up to date there. One small area, but one I'm familiar with where we've got some great coordination is under in forestry. In Washington State with the Forest and Fish Rule, one of the things that Washington State did was provide Clean Water Act assurances in concurrence with EPA, and those assurances expired this year. Director Bellin extended them for 2 years, and we worked closely with EPA as we were and the federal fish agencies on that decision. I think I'm also aware of another joint effort with EPA and Oregon and Idaho on trying to prioritize funding opportunities to reduce toxins here in the Columbia River. So that's an effort, I think that's being led by Region 10. And I know we've got some, our staff are working closely on that and trying to, from Ecology's point of view, point out some projects to identify and quantify sources of contamination that gets into fish.
Neat, thank you. Richard, would you like to add anything on this one?
Yeah, just a couple of things. First of all, on Portland Harbor, there's been a long-standing partnership between EPA and Oregon DEQ on the harbor that continues. Staff are working well together. I can't leave here without mentioning that relationship and the importance of that relationship. Also, between Ecology and Oregon DEQ, we're in the midst of a policy-making effort right now around total dissolved gas levels in the Columbia River related to particularly the 4 lower federal dams in the federal hydropower system. Those standards we're looking at some really innovative approaches on those standards to improve salmonid survival, particularly juvenile salmonids. And I know from Washington's perspective, this is an important part of the effort around orca recovery. And it's also important to Oregon, both the orca piece, but also the salmonid populations in the Oregon basins. And then also with Washington, Ecology, there's quite a bit, at the staff level, there's quite a bit of interaction, again, on efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Washington's done some things that Oregon is looking at. I think Oregon's done some things in terms of clean fuels, for example, that Washington is looking at. So there's overlap and interplay between the two states in that important arena as well.
Thanks. Maybe a different sort of question, a broader question. In getting to know you and your agency, Anthony, what else would you like us to know? Sort of, what haven't we asked you yet?
Well, couple of big priorities that I didn't touch on earlier. It's both at the nationally and regionally. Perfluorinated compounds are sort of, a big emerging area of concern across the country. Awareness is spreading about potential risks and contamination from perfluorinated compounds coatings and through firefighting foam, and we're looking at rulemaking that will make a preliminary regulatory determination for perfluorinated compounds, and I think that's going to carry with it a lot of work here in the Northwest, just in terms of researching it, and depending on what is determined, how we regulate that and how we clean it up if we need to. And so that's been on my mind as we've talked a little bit. In terms of just kind of knowing me personally, my view and why I'm in government and why others are in environmental agencies, I know that there's a spectrum of why people get interested in working for an environmental regulatory agency. And for some, it's an environmental advocacy perspective, that they want to advocate for certain protective actions. They care about people, they care about the natural environment. For others, maybe it's just a job. For me, it's a little bit of all the above, but mostly I'm driven by a deep appreciation, notwithstanding, my comments notwithstanding about attorneys. I have a deep appreciation for the law. And for me, 4 times now in my life, I've taken an oath of office that I swear allegiance to. And a lot of people, it's kind of fun. You even ask people who have taken that oath, and they don't remember what they swore allegiance to. So is it to the President or Congress or the American people or the Declaration of Independence? It's the Constitution, which is the underpinning of our legal system. And so even, our science arm, our Office of Research and Development, we had a meeting a couple of weeks ago where the folks there were saying that science is the underpinning, the foundation of everything that EPA does. And we had a good, robust discussion. We very highly value science in our agency, but it is not the foundation. The law is the foundation of everything we do. The law says we should pursue good science, but at the end of the day, we operate as a system and an organization that's founded on law. And so that's what I appreciate. I appreciate a level playing field and an even application of the law.
Thank you. Rich.
Thanks, that was inspirational. Thank you. So I think for Ecology, one thing that we're, to do the modest boasting, is we're going to be celebrating the agency's 50th birthday next year. So as we like to say, we predated EPA, and our mission to protect and preserve the Washington State environment for today's current and future generations and build a strong economy, that mission continues. And when we, as a way to get to know the agency with our strategic planning effort, we use kind of 4 buckets to kind of both motivate staff and tell the public about our mission. And those 4 buckets are reducing and preparing for climate impacts, preventing and reducing toxic threats, delivering integrated water solutions, and protecting and restoring Puget Sound. And everything we do, we find it fits into some of those compartments, if you will. And that's really helpful when we're going to the legislature seeking additional resources, or when we're executing a regulatory change or making a ruling on a permit. Then to kind of make it a little bit more personal, I'm the junior member on this panel, by the way. I've only been in this role for a couple months, but and to harken back to my motivation, I was always interested in the environment. I remember the first Earth Day, like it was yesterday, and I remember having a discussion with one of my high school buddies, his father, who was a hardworking blue-collar plumber. And I was telling him what I was going to study in college, the environment, and his response to me is, well, who's going to pay you? Are the fish going to pay you? Are the frogs going to pay you? And and that was one of those great challenges early on, because I was able to, I don't think I persuaded him, but I said, no, this is something that we all want. especially in those days when there were, municipal dumps on fire, fish kills. So I knew I could make a difference there. What's going to be happening this coming year, though, is there's going to be a lot of changes in ecology. There's folks who, as you might imagine, are devoted to the mission of ecology, and they've spent most of their professional life there. So we've got a fantastic, talented workforce that is now either retiring or approaching retirement age. So there's a big turnover there. And for folks who are newer in their career, it's going to be a great opportunity for us to bring in new vision, new energy as we continue to work to protect the environment. On top of that, our leadership is changing. Director Bellin announced that she'll be leaving the agency at the end of the month and to spend more time with her family and to maybe try private law practice. She's an attorney too. And our deputy director, after almost 20 years working in that role, is stepping down. So 2020 is going to be a time of change, and I think it's going to be a good change too.
Thank you. Every once in a while you ask a good question, and these have been wonderful answers. Richard, what do you think about what we should know about you or DEQ here?
Well, it's been interesting going at the end of this change just to reflect a little bit on what the Rich and Tony have said. It is an interesting time to be a leader of a public environmental agency, a public agency generally. We're living in a time of some pretty sharp conflict in our nation between different parties and different sectors, and it's actually pretty hard on our managers in all of our agencies. And we had an annual meeting of the DEQ managers about a month ago, and I spent a lot of time talking to our managers about what it means to be a manager in the public sector right now, dealing with some very difficult, very contentious issues that honest people can legitimately disagree about. And what I said to them is I want the public to see Oregon DEQ as being an honest broker of some very difficult and very important issues, an entity that is trusted to take policy direction from the legislature, from our governance body, the Environmental Quality Commission, and to implement the policy direction that we receive from those two areas in a fair and predictable way that people respect. And that's particularly important right now, given the high level of anger that's out there in the public. So that was kind of my direction to the many leaders who are within DEQ. We've kind of gone partly through that generational change that Ecology is looking at right now with very significant turnover in our leadership team. We've got a lot of younger leaders in different parts of the agency, and that's a lot of what gets me going is just the opportunity to work with a younger generation to help them get their feet on the ground, help get the institution pointed in a really solid direction for some very significant challenges that we've got facing us. So it's really a privilege to be DEQ director right now and to help the team really come together and solidify so that they can take on that important work.
Thank you. Maybe to close, a slight curveball, and we can let it go if we want to, but is there a question that you might have for your colleagues here on the stage? Richard, do you have any questions for the folks on the stage?
Let's see. So for Tony, maybe just to talk a little bit about what I just talked about, what it's like to be at EPA right now, and you're having to deal with a ton of conflict, and it can't be easy for kind of line EPA managers and staff. Do you want to talk about that for a minute? I'm not asking you
Sure,
to,
I'd love to.
disagree with your bosses or anything, but just talk a little bit about what it's like to be in public service right now.
So there's a spectrum of experiences, and some of, I did a year in a different role because one of our other managers, a few days, I can't remember if it was a few days before or a few days after the inauguration of the president, said, gee, I can't do this. So I shifted for almost a year to fill that position until they found the right person to be in it long term. So for me, that was about filling a need and maintaining stability in the organization. For that person, it was about their own personal ethics and values and what they could and couldn't live with. And I hear that from a lot of folks. I think, though, very often there are it's a lot of the time it's worse, or it feels worse, or a lot of people are more pessimistic than it actually turns out to be. Not that there are not bad things that come about, or difficult things, I should say. Not to continue with the value judgment about the administration's direction, but for me, I've kind of been used to conflict, as many have, from dealing with individuals in the public who are not happy with us from 30 years ago through today. If you're pleasing everybody, you're probably not doing your job if you're in government. And so I think that's why I appeal so heavily to the idea that the legal system provides that foundation. And for me, morally, I'm okay with, I don't know, I'm kind of rambling, but as long as I do what's ethical and legal, I'm okay with that.
Yeah, thank you very much for that insight. Rich, would you like to ask a question?
Oh, excellent. I get to ask a question. General question, Oregon and Washington share marine waters. They share the Columbia River. What more should we be doing to coordinate our work? I'm happy you mentioned the total dissolved gas rulemaking. That's a good example. But what more can we do to kind of better integrate our regulatory actions and really put them in a way where we're actually solving the problems together as quickly as we can?
That's a great question, Rich. And I have several things immediately leap to mind for me. One, we have been doing some work together in the water resources arena, and this is really more in the area of water quantity, which Oregon DEQ doesn't directly get involved in, than quality. But looking for opportunities for how we manage water resources at the large basin level rather than just stopping at the state border. So there's the great work going on in the Yakima that you mentioned. There's also work going on the Oregon side about how do we recover aquifers that have been largely depleted in the Umatilla area, while also from an economic development point of view, recognizing that is one of the highest value agricultural areas in Oregon. So there are opportunities to work together between Oregon and Washington in that water quantity arena. Also in the water quality arena, we have work going on with EPA and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that Oregon and Washington are watching very closely around temperature in the Columbia. And obviously, temperature is one of the important issues, particularly for returning adult fish in the Columbia that needs continued attention. And then on the ocean side, we've been having conversations, actually all three agencies, around ocean acidification here for a couple years now. And Oregon is in the middle of its triennial review and going to be making a decision here in a couple of months about whether to identify impairment for Oregon's territorial seas for ocean acidification. That's something that we've asked the public for comment on, so if any of you have comment about that, let us know. But I know we've talked with Washington about it, we've also talked with California, we've talked with EPA. It's an ongoing issue, what to do about ocean acidification and how much can the states do in the nearshore environment, and how much is really a global issue that we can't do that much about. So those are some specific areas where there's some important work in conversations going on between the agencies.
Thank you. Anthony, you can ask the last question if you choose.
I thought about trying to ask a question of you, but I couldn't think of a good one, so that's a swing and a miss for your curveball. But so maybe I'll think of it later. I'll find you in the hall. But I guess, there's a lot of attention, a lot of focus on the federal political landscape. So, but all politics at the end of the day is local, and each state is more local than the federal government. And so I'm curious, and have been attentive to the impact and influence of politics in state regulatory work. And some of that's more transparent and some of it's not. And I just wondered if either of you has any comments about political influence at the state level for your agencies.
Well, I'll take a stab at that and then let Rich take a turn also. But so that is something that we have to deal with both at the regulatory policy level, where it's easier to deal with and it's easier to be more transparent about that. When we have legislative folks express an interest in a rulemaking that we're involved in, we point them into the rulemaking process just along with everybody else and try to get their thoughts on the record so that we can reflect that in our decision making. And that happens. Legislators are involved in passing statutes, and then we're implementing those through rules. They often have views about that implementation that I think are, as long as it's done as part of the public process and is transparent, is not only fine, but is perfectly appropriate to be expressed. We have a independent commission that makes those rulemaking decisions, and so it's a really pretty good system that we have for dealing with that. Where things get dicier is if there are attempts to influence enforcement decisions politically, and that is something I have been kind of focused on for Oregon DEQ for the last 6 months or so, making sure that our regional administrators who are responsible for most of those enforcement decisions are following our agency guidance on enforcement and making sure that their managers are following our guidance. And so when there are, as happens from time to time, legislators who have an interest in a particular matter, what I try to do is ask them if they've got thoughts or concerns, ask them to put it in writing, send it to us, and otherwise, if there are attempts beyond that politically, I kind of tend to get my back up in those situations.
Yeah, good points that Richard made on that. I think in Washington State, as probably in other places, the authority we have is granted to us by the legislature through the will of the people. So there's always, a tempering, if you will. As we implement those regulations, we want to make sure we're doing that clearly consistent with the intent and what's in the rule. Otherwise, we run the risk of having the rules changed. And I think at least with the Department of Ecology, we are, if anything, we over-engage with our local legislators. When we've got a significant penalty, we'll contact them ahead of time or simultaneously with issuing the penalty. If we've got a difficult issue that is increasing public concern, we'll reach out to the legislators, elected officials, and let them know what we're doing and why we're doing it. So we err on the side of communication. And there's going to be times when we take decisions that certain members in the either locally elected officials are strongly opposed to, and those are tough decisions. We make them, but we try to do that with as much transparency and coordination as we can. And then there's some times when we're in a hot spot, a tough spot. Recently, we had a catastrophic failure of a Atlantic salmon net pen in Puget Sound, and there could have been a lot of finger pointing between the agencies because there was a multitude of state agencies that each had a regulatory piece of that pie, and we had all been doing our job, but the legislators who were fielding responses from their constituents were very concerned that we weren't doing what we were supposed to be doing. And rather than point fingers, we all worked together on the investigation. We were able to present a very concise summary of how things happen and identified some gaps in the regulations we had. And the legislature took some action on that, based on that. So I don't know if that quite gets at your question. So that was more of a feel-good story. But certainly there are cases where there's individual companies or landowners that have run afoul with environmental regulations, and they avail themselves of their elected representatives. And again, the best way to approach that conversation is, here's the rules that we're charged with enforcing. Here's where we've tried to be flexible. Here's where some things that we really can't look away from. And ultimately, it's a public resource that we're trying to protect.
Rich, thank you, and all of you, thank you very much for sharing with us, for not just your time, but for your leadership. On behalf of this conference, thank you. We thrive on this conversation. So help me thank the panel.